Refugees, climate change, wars, and conflicts. Today we'll be talking about how we can still save the world with Achim Steiner, head of the United Nations Development Program. Mr. Steiner, you've wanted to make the world a better place since finishing college. You went to India to help out in a small village. What did you do there?
It was a kind of apprenticeship. I was eager to work for an organization in India, in Tamil Nadu state. I wanted to get to know development work on the ground and to get a better sense of what I could contribute to it. That was my first year in India. And my subsequent career took me to many other countries, too.
Was it also about having an adventure, or just about helping others?
Of course, there was a sense of adventure, but I had the clear objective of gaining qualifications in this area of work. I was a student who had graduated from Oxford, so I probably thought I knew everything one needed to know. So it was an interesting experience to be with a Gandhian development organization on the ground, where we had just one room. We spent the night there on straw mats. During the day, we'd work and eat with the local people while trying to promote development. It was a very interesting perspective, and it stayed with me.
Today, you are the third most powerful person at the United Nations with a budget of $5 billion. But your power is not enough to wipe out hunger once and for all. Is that frustrating? Having so much influence, but no quick solutions?
Power is something to be treated with caution. Sure, the United Nations is a very big organization, and I head the largest organization within the UN family. The $5 billion for the development program is a lot of money. It enables us to operate in 170 countries, working with people on a daily basis, resolving problems and improving people's lives. So that does mean enormous power. But although $5 billion sounds like a huge amount to us as private individuals, it's really a drop in the ocean. So we have to make intelligent use of it.
Okay, but there are still 815 million people in the world going hungry. Isn't that simply unacceptable?
It is unacceptable, which is why we're working on this issue as a global community, NGOs, the UN, and national governments. But remember that we've seen astonishing progress in development over the last 300 or 400 years. 400 or 500 years ago, 9 out of 10 people lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's just 1 out of 10. That's something we must not forget. Ultimately, it's also a reason to look optimistically to the future. We can put an end to poverty, especially extreme poverty, but it requires international solidarity and cooperation.
It also requires money. U.S. President Donald Trump wants to slash the budget his country has been paying to the UN. Aren't you also afraid that others will follow his example in these times of growing national self-interest?
We are living in a political climate where nationalism, protectionism, and isolationism have become a tempting option, and one administration in Washington has already begun reducing its funding for the UN. I can only repeat my appeal for others in the world to see things in proportion. What we invest in international cooperation amounts to less than 0.7% of the world's GDP. That's the minimum we need to solve these problems together. The world cannot be regulated by itself or by one major power. So regardless of whether it's the administration in Washington or Europe, the appeal is still, we need your support. We have to work together to overcome these problems, issues that could otherwise become massive problems closer to home.
Indeed. So what if there isn't enough money for aid? Is Syria a drastic example?
It's often forgotten that the waves of refugees a few years ago were ultimately triggered by the lack of response to appeals from the United Nations. In the case of Syria, too, we had refugee camps in countries that border Syria. They were the first to take in refugees. We had to close schools and clinics and cut food rations because we didn't get the funding we needed to help the refugees there. People in desperate circumstances, unable to get medical care or schooling for their children, unable to feed their families, have only one option: to move on again. We have to put far greater focus on prevention. That's also the goal of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres: intervening earlier, identifying crises as they emerge, so that we're not reduced to being a fire truck or an ambulance when it's already too late.
There are many crises and violent conflicts around the world. The UN says there are 65 million displaced persons, most of them in Africa. Is Europe truly aware of the dimension of this problem and its repercussions for us in Europe?
In recent years, Europe has learned, perhaps more than any other region, the consequences of failing to recognize new refugee crises in time, and the need for the international community to act together. In addition, Europe is itself having an identity crisis, a clash between its values and objectives, and the reality of dealing with all the pressure involved. These are real political points of debate in practically every country. At the same time, there's a certain helplessness. These developments are taking place on a scale that we're not accustomed to.
Europe is being seen as a continent that says development aid has to stop people becoming refugees. As in, we give the Africans money to put up the fences there that we don't want to see in Europe, right?
That's not how I would address the issue. Sure, there are people who use that argument, but I've always said that if we help countries in Africa to build up their economies so that people have jobs and opportunities for the future, that will provide a boost for those countries' development. The fact that this also has the positive effect of getting people to stay in their countries and reducing the problem of migration and refugees, along with the pressures on a region like Europe, does not delegitimize cooperation. We are actually joining the two aims, but you can't subordinate one to the other.
But what you're aiming for is not something that takes effect quickly. People won't wait. Can you change the situation in the short term?
Yes, you can. Given the dramatic situation with millions of people becoming refugees, I've already explained the need for substantial investment in countries that are under more pressure than others, that have a greater burden to bear. Neighboring countries are where the refugees go first. Most people want to return eventually because it's their homeland. Their relatives live there. They want to go back. But if people find refuge not in neighboring countries but further afield, with their children growing up in a different culture, then it's less likely that they'll return. So the first thing is to intervene immediately in crises. We're also busy organizing the return of refugees, not just in Syria, but also in Iraq. When towns were liberated from the IS terrorists by the international community and the Iraqi government, we were there within 24 to 48 hours. We started restoring water supplies and power and repairing school roofs and hospital windows so people could return to their homes as quickly as possible. That's also part of development work.
And ultimately, those regions need to see more wealth so that people have prospects worth staying for. You used to head the UN's environment program. Can development lead to greater prosperity without a negative impact on the environment?
We're seeing in many areas how renewable energy technology, in particular, is enjoying an enormous boom right now. It's essentially an energy revolution, and one where Germany showed the way forward.
But I was talking about developing countries. Looking at Africa, the impression is often one of China securing the raw materials of the continent without consideration for the environment. And investment in production only goes where social and wage standards are lower. That's the way it is.
That's one viewpoint. China is now the world's leading producer of renewable energy technologies, and it's becoming a major investor in renewables technology in Africa as well. One of the reasons for low kilowatt-hour prices for renewables is that China has drastically reduced the cost for these technologies on the global market. This is a segment that has increased accessibility to electricity, in Africa in particular. So it's oversimplifying things to just look for mistakes between one block and another. We're working today in a global network. We're living in an age where we have to reinvent our economies, our infrastructure, our energy and transportation sectors. Positive economic development will be increasingly linked to sustainability and how we implement its principles. The financial sector is currently starting to discover that.
Based on what you're saying, any solution will take time. And now, we'll conclude our talk by asking you to complete 3 sentences for us. Despite all the conflict and crises, I remain optimistic about development policy because
we ultimately have to be united to take effective action, and that's a perspective that still enjoys widespread popular support.
What connects me to my native Brazil is
confidence in the future, despite all the difficulties to be overcome.
For my children, I wish to see a world
that responds more quickly and gives them the freedom to make decisions. Climate change has become an example of how things that we do not decide result in our children being denied the chance to shape their own future as they envisage it.
Achim Steiner, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.